For a long time, there has been this idea that France sucks at war. It was especially embedded by Krembots who claimed that in the case of a war on the European continent, the Russian military would, quote, destroy them very quickly, end quote. Even though Russia has faced significant setbacks in Ukraine, they still persist on this idea. They always point out the word that France hates the most, the word surrender. Since Russians love World War II so much that they compare everything they go through with it, a lot of them have compared their struggles with the Chernobyl disaster to it, they compared Chechnya, and as we've seen in the news, they're comparing the current war in Ukraine to World War II. They use it as a metaphor to claim that they always win and point to how everyone else sucks. When the finger points to France, they only highlight the surrender. But this idea has actually been around for a long time and has been laughed at by everyone. It has been at the constant end of jokes and memes.
God! The French are neutral! This is not my fight! This is not... We surrender!
Anyone who says such a thing has no knowledge of history or France's capabilities. This may come as a surprise to people, but France actually won the majority of wars it actually fought in throughout history. It was one of the largest empires in the world, and because of it, French is spoken on every continent. Let's start from the beginning. The early French were called Franks. They were a Germanic tribe that pushed westward after the fall of the Roman Empire and settled in the modern nation of France. Like many kingdoms in the Middle Ages, they fought against their neighbors for control of land, but the area that we know as France today didn't change that much. That's where the people had settled and remained there. The first breakthrough of the French was in the 8th century. After North African and Arab kingdoms had conquered the Iberian Peninsula, they pushed into Frankish territory. Under King Charles Martel, the early French managed to stop the Umayyad advance at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. Yes, it was the French who stopped an African colonization of Europe, something that populists should be proud of. Throughout the Middle Ages, the French fought numerous wars against other European powers, the most famous of which was the 100 Years' War. And no matter how you want to put it, the French won that war by driving the English out in 1453. During the Age of Discovery, the French became one of the most powerful empires in the world, spreading to every corner. As a result, to this day, France still has overseas territories on every continent. When you put them all together, France is actually the 5th largest nation in the world. Let's also not forget that the American Revolution was won in part due to France, as they significantly helped the American colonists break free from the British. The peak of this French power was in the early 1800s, with Napoleon becoming the most powerful ruler in Europe for over a decade. And even after Napoleon fell, like all emperors do, the French nation continued to exist, even forming a second empire in the mid-19th century before eventually becoming a republic again. Going into the 20th century, we have to talk about the World Wars. Whereas World War II is the more popular topic for other nations, for France, it's actually World War I. This was an industrial war that shook the world, and the majority of fighting on the Western Front was actually done in France. As Belgium became a rump state, large swaths of the French countryside were turned into blackened earth with mazes of trenches. The effects are still visible today. Throughout the war, the French achieved many successes, such as their victory at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Another moment that shows the psyche of French soldiers during World War I was the Nivelle Offensive. In that battle, thousands of men were sent on suicide attacks, and as a result, there were mutinies in the ranks where troops refused to advance forward. But despite their decision to rebel, they did not desert or throw down their weapons. They remained on the defensive, willing to push back any potential German advance. This goes to show that even when mutinying, the French were still willing to fight. Throughout the rest of World War I, the French stood with the rest of the Allies. They won in the end, and not once did they actually surrender there. But the next global war that came a generation later was a bit different. World War II is what gave France the stereotype of a surrendering nation. On May 10, 1940, German forces had entered France after breaking through Poland and the Low Countries. After only 6 weeks of fighting, Paris formally surrendered, and the entire country was either occupied or turned into a puppet state known as Vichy France. It was not until the invasion of Normandy 3 years later that France actually became free. The sheer speed at which the country fed into the stereotype that the French were an inept military power. There were actually multiple factors that led to the fall of France. I mean, geography was a big factor. France didn't have the protection of the high seas such as Britain, or the mountains of Switzerland, or the landmass of the Soviet Union. With little time and them being unable to prepare big defenses, the Blitzkrieg was bound to take over the country. The country didn't surrender because they gave it their all then. They surrendered because they didn't want a repeat of the recent past on their own soil. Even if they continued fighting, the result would have been the same. The only thing different would have been the German reprisal. At the beginning of the war, Polish cities were wiped off the face of the earth because they continued fighting. Both the culture and the people suffered greatly. The French people would have suffered this as well, and so the wiser option was to retreat either to Britain or North Africa, where they can regroup before going back out on the offensive. But what really deserves more attention is that France continued fighting even after the surrender. The French resistance conducted a lot of intelligence and sabotage operations during the occupation. It was also worth noting that the Free French forces persisted and managed to secure French colonies and protectorates. These regions continued fighting against the Germans. They even took part in the liberation of France in 1944. And, just like the previous World War, they still won alongside the Allies. Moving into the modern world, France continues to be a military power even after decolonization. They're one of the few nuclear powers on the planet. The NATO air campaign in Libya was actually not led by the US. It was actually led by France. Yeah, the French are actually the only NATO nation other than the US to be able to operate all over the world for prolonged periods of time. That is largely because they have the logistical capability. And in addition to the fight they had in Afghanistan, they have also fought Islamic extremists in countries such as Chad, Mali, and the Ivory Coast. They are currently doing more than many other countries are actually doing right now. You need to look at their entire history to know that there is much more to this country. The world wouldn't be the same today without them. One only needs to look at the successes they have had over the centuries to see how courageous and successful they can be on the battlefield.